Hello, my name is Robert Thomas. Today we're going to be talking about the science of reading and applying it into our secondary content areas. Let's move on to our next slide. So what is the science of reading? The science of reading is essentially a large body of research. It's been studied over the years. It essentially tells us the most effective methods to teach reading. It focuses on phonemic awareness, phonics, vocabulary comprehension. A good example of this is Scarborough's reading rote. And essentially what it does is it takes all the parts of language comprehension, like background knowledge, vocabulary, literacy knowledge, wrapping them around one another to form one chain, and then word recognition, wrapping it into another chain, braiding those together to form a skilled reader or a reading rote. Now, on our third slide, we look at why does it matter. So these are the ELA scores from Georgia, 3rd to 8th grade in 2024 and 2025. So we see that the proficiency rate is around 40% for 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. And then as we look at 6th grade, it's 25%, 7th is 28%, and 8th grade is 35% respectively. And while we do see that as they get old, students are getting older, they are going from beginning ELA comprehension to developing, the proficiency rate is unfortunately staying the same, which means we don't have a lot of developing readers going up to proficient and above. And there's a lot of myths surrounding our science of reading. The first one is that if a student can read words, they can read anything, and that unfortunately is just not true. Just reading the words in themselves is not comprehending them. It's not understanding them in a wider context of the unit, as well as understanding the background of the word. Myth 2 is that reading instruction is only necessary in elementary school. Unfortunately, we see a lot of students struggling in middle and high school as well, and those students need instruction that's targeted for them. Myth 3 is that students who struggle with reading will naturally catch up over time. As a matter of fact, it's the opposite. Students are going to fall farther behind as they get older because the reading is going to get harder. They're going to comprehend less. Unless there's intervention to help them, they're only going to fall farther behind. And then myth 4 is that independent reading alone will fix reading problems. And while independent reading and practice is extremely important in reading comprehension, you're going to need targeted intervention in the long run if you want a student to pick up where they are at and rise to where their peers are. So the literacy demands in my content area, we see the difference between primary sources and then our textbook or our workbook pages. For instance, our primary sources are written very legally, very formal language. Of course, it's coming from things like government documents, and this particular one's the Canadian Constitution Act of 1867. It's going to require interpretation. It's going to require an understanding of where that particular document is, the context of it. And then in our textbook or workbook or handouts or whatever it may be, it is a much more direct explanation of the concept, defines the government roles better. It also has a more modern vocabulary, and it's easier to read. It's made for students. However, there may still be words and vocabulary that students need to be briefed on to make sure they understand text fully as well. Now, some sources that can assist in this research, the Adaptive Reader as well as Verlazzo's teacher blog have some great strategies with them. So speaking of strategies, there's a couple that we can do to help our students. We're going to start off here with explicit vocabulary instructions. So essentially what this is doing is just before each unit, you're going through and you're pulling out that vocabulary that might be hard for your students, and you're teaching it to them, making sure they understand it one at a time. So for instance, in this example, the word is parliament. The definition is that it is Canada's lawmaking body, and we're going to give an example that they may be able to relate to, in this case, the United States Congress. Now, if a student doesn't know what the United States Congress is, and a lot of sixth graders will not, we'll have to find a different example, whether it's a pop culture reference or something they're going to understand. But as long as we can relate it back to them and help them understand what it is, that's what's important. Building background knowledge. We want to make sure that before we jump into a unit, we explain to them the proper context for it, correct? So before we're talking about Canada's government, we may show them a map of Canada, show them a short video introducing Canada's government and their political system. For an example, we know that they know Canada has provinces. What we want them to know by the end of the period or unit is how does Parliament work with those provinces. And then hopefully at the end of that unit, we can evaluate them and see what they have learned. And hopefully they have learned how the Parliament works through those provinces. On slide 7, we see the close reading of complex text. So we take this complicated text about Parliament, consisting of the upper house and the House of Commons, and we'd have the students either individually or as a class circle unfamiliar terms that they're not sure about, maybe underline the important ideas within this text. and of course writing questions. So we're doing this as a class. We can make sure that everyone understands all parts, and we'll break this down almost every word if every student is contributing. So hopefully some of those questions would be like, what is Parliament? What is House of Commons? Does Canada have a king? I didn't know Canada had a king. How is this close to the United States government? And then lastly, my favorite, morphology and the academic language. So this is very helpful, especially within government. We have words like bicameral and unicameral, democracy and autocracy. The students are always getting confused, even though they're not that difficult. Bicameral and unicameral being broken down is one of my favorite and easiest ones. So cameral means a chamber or legislative house. Uni means one, bi means two. So once we get rid of the cameral, we know that the only difference in those words are bi and uni. Bi meaning two, uni meaning one. And all of a sudden, the students aren't missing that question on my formatives anymore. So what are some barriers to this? Well, first, limited training in the science of reading. Not all teachers and academic instructors have been briefed on this, as well as time constraints within our content area classes. We're already trying to get our standards checked off, making sure our students understand. So having to work the science of reading into those lessons can also offer another barrier. And of course, we have a wide range of student reading abilities. Some students are going to excel, some students are going to be farther behind, and we have to figure out how to differentiate this in order to reach all of our students. How do we overcome those challenges? Well, we can do professional development to focus on reading strategies. We can integrate the literacy instruction that we have into the lessons that we've already made, right? Our lessons are already there. Let's take the science of reading and some of these strategies and work them into our class, whether it's an introduction, whether it's a closing, whether it's an activity. And that brings us to our next one, which is using tools like vocabulary supports, right? Graphic organizers. We can work those into our existing instructions quite easy, and that's going to help us keep our students up to date and help work those science of reading strategies into our already existing lessons. There's a lot of tools you can use for this. Some helpful sites. We talked about the Adaptive Reader and for Laszlo's teacher blog earlier. News ELA, ReadWorks, and Common Lit are also some other ones. They're very good at getting text that you can differentiate for students within the class based on their reading level or comprehension level. They have vocabulary supports as well as those reading scaffolds we talked about earlier. So what small changes can we make to really make a big impact on our students? Well, the first is pre-teaching that vocabulary. Before we even start a unit, we should be looking at vocabulary, seeing which words are our students going to struggle with, regardless of the grade level, which words are they going to have a problem with. Let's teach them those so they're not worried about what these words mean in the middle of the lessons. They already go in understanding them. Building that background knowledge, like we said earlier, I'm going to make sure they understand exactly what we're talking about before we go into Canada's government. What is Canada? How does Canada function? What provinces are there? Teaching those word parts, as we spoke about earlier with the morphology, that's going to go a long way. Breaking them down into prefixes and the suffixes, and then using scaffolds such as graphic organizers and targeted activities will also help as well. These are the references. I used several sites. Some I pulled graphics from, some I pulled ideas from, some I read and helped me formulate my ideas. They were all great. I certainly learned something through this, and I hope that you did too. Thank you.